On a cold 4th century morning, bishops from across the Roman Empire gathered to decide the fate of the Christian faith. But it wasn't just an ordinary theological matter that awaited them. A heresy had spread like wildfire, questioning the very nature of Jesus Christ. The question echoing through the halls was disturbing. Was Jesus truly the eternal Son of God, or merely a man adopted by divinity? If you're here because you're curious about the hidden mysteries of Christian history, you need to subscribe to the channel right now. Click the red button and turn on notifications, because we're going to reveal truths that few know about the battles that shaped Christianity as we know it today. This isn't just another religious story. It's the account of an ideological war that nearly destroyed the early church. The name of this heresy was Adoptionism, and its proponents had compelling arguments. They cited biblical verses that seemed to support their theory. At Jesus' baptism, when a voice from heaven declared, "This is my beloved Son," that would have been the exact moment of divine adoption. Before that, Jesus would have been just an ordinary man chosen by God for a special mission. The logic was seductive and dangerous. But why did this doctrine pose such a grave threat? Why did emperors get involved and councils get hastily convened? The answer leads us to a deep understanding of how seemingly abstract doctrines can shake the foundations of an entire civilization. Adoptionism wasn't just a theological curiosity, it was a ticking time bomb threatening to explode the unity of the Roman Empire. To fully understand this story, we need to go back to the origins, when the first Christians were still struggling to define who Jesus Christ truly was. The seeds of controversy were already planted in the Gospels, waiting for the right moment to germinate and grow into an existential threat to Christian orthodoxy. In the early centuries of Christianity, the church faced a monumental challenge: how to explain the nature of Jesus Christ in a way that made sense to both Jews and Gentiles. The Gospels offered clues, but they also created enigmas. Luke presents detailed genealogies, Matthew emphasizes the fulfillment of prophecies, John speaks of the Word made flesh. Each account seemed to suggest different aspects of Christ's identity. Jewish Christians had their own difficulties accepting Jesus' full divinity. Raised in strict monotheism, they questioned how Jesus could be simultaneously God and man without compromising divine uniqueness. For many, the most logical solution was adoptionism. Jesus was born human, but was elevated to divine status at some point in his earthly life. This explanation preserved monotheism while still honoring Jesus as the Messiah. Paul of Samosata, Bishop of Antioch in the 3rd century, was one of the first prominent leaders to embrace this doctrine. He preached that Jesus was an ordinary man who, due to his exemplary life and perfect obedience, was adopted by God as his son. His sermons attracted crowds because they offered a rational explanation for the mystery of the incarnation. Jesus became an inspiring model of how humanity could achieve divinity through righteousness. But Paul of Samosata was not alone. Theodotus of Byzantium, a wealthy leather merchant who moved to Rome, also advocated similar ideas. He argued that Jesus received the Holy Spirit at his baptism, becoming Christ at that specific moment. Before that, he was just Jesus of Nazareth, a talented and pious carpenter. The distinction was crucial. Jesus, the man, became Christ, the anointed one, through a divine act of adoption. The popularity of these ideas grew, especially among educated Christians in the empire's large cities. They offered an elegant reconciliation between Greek philosophy, which valued reason, and Christian faith. However, other leaders began to realize the dangerous implications of this doctrine for human salvation and redemption. Theodotus of Byzantium arrived in Rome around 190 AD with more than just merchandise in his luggage. He brought with him a revolutionary interpretation of the Gospels that would soon find fertile ground in the empire's capital. His secret meetings attracted intellectuals, merchants, and even some clergy who felt uneasy with the inexplicable mysteries of the traditional doctrine of Christ. Theodotus's method was sophisticated and convincing. He didn't reject the scriptures, but he reinterpreted them through a rationalist lens. When Jesus said, "I and the Father are one," Theodotus explained that this union happened progressively, starting at baptism and culminating in the resurrection. Jesus was not eternally divine, but became divine through a process of spiritual adoption that any pious person could, in theory, experience. Artemon, a disciple of Theodotus, took his master's ideas even further. He established a school in Rome where he taught textual criticism techniques to correct the scriptures that seemed to support Jesus' eternal divinity. Artemon argued that Orthodox copyists had altered the original texts to support their doctrines. His school produced corrected manuscripts that circulated among sympathetic Christian communities. Artemon's influence extended beyond theology. He organized a network of scribes and translators who disseminated adoptionist literature throughout the empire. His letters reached Christian communities in Gaul, Hispania, and Africa, always accompanied by carefully crafted biblical arguments. The movement was becoming international, and Orthodox bishops began to alarm at its rapid expansion. What made adoptionism particularly dangerous was its veneer of orthodoxy. Its proponents did not deny Jesus' importance nor question his authority. On the contrary, they exalted him as the perfect example of how a human being could be elevated to divine status. This message was especially attractive to converts from paganism, who were accustomed to stories of heroes becoming gods. Pope Victor. I could no longer ignore the growth of the adoptionist movement when alarming reports began to arrive from all parts of the empire. Entire communities were abandoning the traditional doctrine of Christ, and local bishops were urgently requesting guidance. In an unprecedented decision, Victor convened a special synod in Rome to address this threat to Christian orthodoxy exclusively. Hippolytus of Rome emerged as the leading intellectual opponent of adoptionism. His argument was devastating. If Jesus was merely adopted as the Son of God, then his death on the cross would have no power to redeem humanity. Only someone who was truly God from eternity could offer a sacrifice of infinite value for the sins of the world. Adoptionism, therefore, not only distorted Christology but destroyed Christian soteriology. Tertullian, writing from Carthage, took a more aggressive approach. He coined the term Sabellian modalism to describe some variants of adoptionism and wrote entire treatises refuting its arguments. Tertullian argued that accepting adoptionism was opening the door to all sorts of heresies, because once the eternal nature of Christ was questioned, nothing else in Christian doctrine would be safe. The Orthodox strategy was twofold: to combat adoptionism through theological argumentation and simultaneously to excommunicate its main proponents. Theodotus was formally excommunicated by Victor I, but this only increased his popularity among the dissidents. Artemon suffered the same fate, but continued to teach in his school, now presenting himself as a martyr for truth against ecclesiastical tyranny. However, the Orthodox faced a significant strategic problem. The more they attacked adoptionism, the more attention they drew to its arguments. Many ordinary Christians, who had never questioned Christ's nature, began to take an interest in theological debates and discovered that the questions raised by the adoptionists were more complex than they had imagined. By the early 3rd century, adoptionism had infiltrated the highest echelons of the Christian church. It was no longer just curious merchants and intellectuals embracing these ideas. Ordained bishops, respected deacons, and even some members of Roman senatorial families began to publicly question the traditional doctrine of Christ's nature. The heresy was becoming mainstream, and this terrified the Orthodox leadership. Paul of Samosata represented the peak of this infiltration. As Bishop of Antioch, one of the most important sees in early Christianity, he had the authority to ordain priests, consecrate bishops, and influence doctrines in a vast region. His adoptionist sermons were not whispered in secret meetings but proclaimed from the cathedral pulpit before thousands of faithful who received them as genuine orthodoxy. Paul's theological sophistication was impressive. He developed a complex Christology that distinguished between the eternal Logos of God and Jesus of Nazareth. According to his theory, the Logos dwelt in Jesus progressively, starting at baptism and gradually increasing until the resurrection. Jesus was not the incarnate Logos, but the human temple where the Logos chose to dwell. This distinction seemingly resolved all tensions between divinity and humanity. The practical implications of this doctrine were revolutionary. If Jesus achieved divinity through a process of spiritual growth, then other devout Christians could aspire to the same destiny. Paul taught that salvation was not just forgiveness of sins, but potential deification. This message empowered the faithful and created a dynamic spirituality that contrasted with traditional orthodoxy, often seen as static and mysterious. But Paul's influence extended beyond theology. He used his position to appoint sympathetic bishops in smaller cities, creating a network of adoptionist leadership that spread throughout Syria, Asia Minor, and even parts of Palestine. When the Orthodox finally realized the extent of this infiltration, they discovered they were facing not just an isolated heresy, but an organized movement with its own episcopal structure. The situation changed dramatically when the Christological disputes began to affect the political stability of the Roman Empire. Emperor Aurelian, who ruled during a time of crisis and barbarian invasions, had no patience for religious divisions that could weaken imperial unity. When two Christian factions in Antioch began to claim legitimacy, one supporting Paul of Samosata and the other demanding his deposition, Aurelian decided to intervene personally. The imperial decision was pragmatic and revealing. Aurelian was not interested in the theological details of the controversy, but was concerned with public order and the loyalty of the Christian populations. He consulted bishops from Rome and other major cities, finding that the majority opposed Paul of Samosata. Based on this consultation, Aurelian ordered the deposition of Paul and the transfer of ecclesiastical buildings to his Orthodox opponents. The imperial intervention created a dangerous precedent that would have lasting consequences for Christianity. For the first time, a Roman emperor decided Christian doctrinal matters based on political considerations. Paul of Samosata was exiled, but his followers interpreted this as political persecution disguised as religious orthodoxy. Adoptionism gained an aura of martyrdom that increased its appeal to Christians dissatisfied with the ecclesiastical hierarchy. Paradoxically, the Orthodox victory created new problems. Paul of Samosata in exile became an even more influential figure than when he was bishop. His letters circulated clandestinely, portraying him as a defender of biblical truth against political religious corruption. He developed a theology of resistance that combined adoptionism with criticism of imperial power, creating a form of alternative Christianity that attracted both religious and political dissidents. The seeds were sown for an even greater crisis. Adoptionism, which had begun as an academic theological dispute, now had political, social, and even economic dimensions. Different regions of the empire embraced conflicting interpretations of Christ's nature, and these differences began to affect trade alliances, marriages between influential families, and even military agreements between cities. Adoptionism was not a monolithic doctrine, but a spectrum of related beliefs that adapted to the theological and cultural needs of different regions. In Hispania, Elipandus of Toledo developed a sophisticated version that distinguished between natural filiation and adoptive filiation of Christ. According to his theory, Jesus was the natural Son of God as the eternal Logos, but the adoptive Son as a man. This distinction allowed for the preservation of some aspects of orthodoxy while retaining adoptionist elements. Felix of Urgel, a disciple and collaborator of Elipandus, took these ideas even further. He argued that Jesus' divine adoption happened in stages, first at the virginal birth, then at the baptism, again at the transfiguration, and finally at the resurrection. Each stage represented a deeper level of union between Jesus' humanity and divinity. This progressive adoption explained apparent contradictions in the Gospels about when Jesus demonstrated full awareness of his divine nature. In North Africa, adoptionism took on different characteristics, influenced by local philosophical traditions. Some theologians developed a theory of divine participation, which suggested that Jesus was not adopted as the unique Son, but as the supreme representative of all humanity. His divine adoption was, therefore, a cosmic event that opened the way for other human beings to participate in the divine nature through mystical union with Christ. The Christian communities of the East created their own variations, often mixing adoptionist elements with Gnostic and mystical traditions. Some groups taught that Jesus possessed two bodies, one physical and mortal, which was adopted by God, and another spiritual and eternal, which was genuinely divine. During his earthly life, these two bodies coexisted, but only the spiritual body truly participated in the resurrection. This diversity of interpretations made combating adoptionism extremely complex for the Orthodox. It was not enough to refute one specific version of the heresy, because other variants immediately emerged that corrected the apparent deficiencies of the previous one. Adoptionism was becoming a theological hydra. Cutting off one head resulted in the growth of two others. The Orthodox Church needed a more comprehensive and definitive strategy. If you're following this journey through the mysteries of Christian history, you can't miss the next episodes. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell, because we're going to continue unraveling secrets that changed the course of Christianity forever. The story is just heating up, and you need to be with us when we reveal the final battles that decided the fate of this dangerous heresy. In the 4th century, the situation had become untenable. Different regions of the Roman Empire practiced contradictory versions of Christianity, and these differences began to create serious political tensions. Christian merchants from Orthodox regions refused to do business with their adoptionist co-religionists. Marriages between families of different Christological traditions were canceled. Christianity, which was supposed to unify the empire, was becoming a source of division and conflict. Constantine the High observed these developments with growing concern. A recent convert to Christianity and dependent on Christian support to legitimize his rule, the emperor could not allow doctrinal disputes to fragment his power base. Christian divisions threatened not only religious stability, but the very unity of the empire. Constantine knew he had to act decisively to restore Christian harmony. The situation became even more complicated when some adoptionist bishops began to form alliances with Arian groups who denied Christ's full divinity for different but related reasons. This heretical coalition represented an existential threat to Christian orthodoxy. If Arians and adoptionists joined forces, they could have sufficient numbers to dominate any general council and officially redefine Christian doctrine. Alarming reports constantly reached the imperial palace. Orthodox bishops were expelled from their cities by adoptionist sympathizers. Churches were occupied by rival factions who held liturgies with contradictory Christologies. In some regions, different Christian groups built separate temples and refused to recognize each other's legitimacy. Christianity was fragmenting before everyone's eyes. Constantine finally understood that partial measures would not resolve the crisis. A definitive event was needed to establish once and for all which version of Christianity would be considered orthodox in the empire. The idea of a general council began to take shape in the imperial mind, but no one yet imagined the epic proportions this gathering would assume. Preparations for the Council of Nicaea began with a meticulous correspondence campaign. Constantine sent personal letters to all bishops in the empire, orthodox and heretical, inviting them to what he described as the most important meeting in Christian history. The emperor promised free transport, imperial lodging, and personal protection for all participants. It was an offer impossible to refuse, but also a summons impossible to ignore. The adoptionist leaders knew they faced a decisive moment. Eusebius of Nicomedia, a sympathizer of adoptionist ideas and influential at the imperial court, worked intensively to ensure his faction had significant representation at the council. He organized preparatory meetings where bishops of similar leanings coordinated strategies and arguments. Everyone understood that Nicaea could be their last chance to legitimize their doctrines. On the Orthodox side, Hosius of Cordova, Constantine's personal advisor, took the lead in the anti-heretical campaign. He secretly traveled through various provinces, meeting with Orthodox bishops to secure their participation and coordinate a united front against adoptionism and Arianism. Hosius knew that it wasn't enough to be theologically right. It was also necessary to have numerical superiority and political articulation. The choice of Nicaea as the council's location was strategic. The city was located close to the imperial capital, facilitating Constantine's presence, but sufficiently far from major Christian centers to avoid local pressures. Furthermore, Nicaea had traditions of hospitality and adequate infrastructure to host hundreds of bishops with their retinues. The symbolism was also important. A neutral city for a decision that would affect all of Christianity. The weeks leading up to the council were marked by intense diplomatic activity. Bishops of different factions met in private gatherings, trying to form coalitions and identify possible allies. Documents circulated secretly, containing compromise proposals and doctrinal formulations that could satisfy multiple tendencies. Everyone knew that the moment of truth had arrived for adoptionism and other Christological heresies. In May 325 AD, around 300 bishops from across the empire gathered in the Great Hall of the Imperial Palace in Nicaea. The atmosphere was tense and solemn. Everyone understood they were participating in a historic event that would define the future of Christianity. Constantine opened the sessions with a dramatic speech, calling for unity and warning that Christian divisions threatened the stability of the empire that God had entrusted to his care. The proponents of adoptionism presented their arguments with impressive eloquence and erudition. They extensively cited the scriptures, especially passages that seemed to distinguish between Jesus as a man and Christ as the divine Son. Their spokesman argued that Jesus' divine adoption did not diminish his authority, but increased it, because it demonstrated that God could elevate humanity to heavenly heights. The presentation was convincing and caused murmuring among some undecided bishops. However, the Orthodox response was devastating. Hosius and other leaders demonstrated that adoptionism, taken to its logical conclusions, destroyed the possibility of genuine redemption. If Jesus was merely an adopted man, then his death could not pay for the sins of all humanity. Furthermore, if Jesus was not eternally divine, then worshiping him would be idolatry. The Orthodox arguments appealed not only to theology but to the practical implications for daily Christian life. The debate intensified when some bishops presented ancient manuscripts that supposedly supported adoptionist interpretations. The Orthodox responded with their own textual evidence and arguments based on apostolic tradition. The discussion became highly technical, involving detailed analyses of Greek words, historical contexts, and patristic interpretations. Constantine, who did not grasp the theological subtleties, began to show impatience with the complexity of the debates. The tension culminated when Constantine personally intervened, declaring that the empire needed doctrinal unity immediately. He proposed that the council formulate a definitive creed that all bishops must accept under penalty of exile. The proposal transformed a theological debate into a political decision with existential consequences for all participants. The commission tasked with drafting the creed worked day and night for several weeks, aware that every word could have eternal consequences for Christianity. The Orthodox bishops insisted on the inclusion of the phrase true God and true man for Jesus Christ, a formulation that automatically made adoptionism heretical. Adoptionist representatives struggled to include language that allowed for alternative interpretations, but met fierce resistance from the Orthodox majority. The term homoousios, of the same substance, became the center of controversy. The Orthodox argued that Jesus must be declared homoousios, with the Father from eternity, not just after his earthly adoption. The adoptionists proposed homoousios, of similar substance, which allowed for more flexible interpretations. The debate over a single Greek letter, an iota, determined the fate of millions of Christians throughout the empire. Constantine showed increasing frustration with the linguistic disputes and threatened to end the council without resolution if the bishops did not reach an agreement quickly. His political pressure was decisive. Many bishops who sympathized with moderate positions aligned themselves with orthodoxy out of fear of imperial consequences. Theology was being determined by realpolitik, and all participants understood this uncomfortable reality. The final version of the Nicene Creed was an overwhelming victory for orthodoxy. The text declared Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of God, begotten of the Father before all ages, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not created, of the same substance as the Father. Each phrase was an explicit rejection of adoptionism. The language left no room for alternative interpretations. When it came time for the final vote, the pressure on the adoptionist bishops was unbearable. They faced an impossible choice: sign a document that contradicted their deepest convictions, or face exile, persecution, and the destruction of their communities. Most chose survival, signing the creed with mental reservations they hoped to express later. The signing of the Nicene Creed did not immediately end the adoptionist controversy, but it fundamentally changed its nature. Proponents of the heresy could no longer operate openly within the official episcopal structure, forcing them to develop clandestine networks of teaching and propagation. Bishops who had signed the creed under political pressure began discreetly to teach interpretations that minimized its anti-adoptionist implications. Eusebius of Nicomedia, despite having signed the creed, immediately began working for its subversion. He used his influence at the imperial court to promote sympathetic bishops to important positions and gradually build a coalition that could reverse the Nicene decisions. His strategy was patient and sophisticated, not to attack the creed directly but to reinterpret it in a way that allowed for substantially adoptionist doctrines. Local Christian communities reacted in various ways to the conciliar decisions. Many congregations that had embraced adoptionism simply ignored the Nicene Creed, continuing to practice their faith as before. Orthodox bishops found that implementing Nicene orthodoxy required constant vigilance and often direct confrontation with faithful laity who preferred simpler and more intuitive adoptionist interpretations. Constantine attempted to enforce the conciliar decisions through imperial edicts that ordered the destruction of adoptionist literature and the deposition of non-compliant clergy. However, the practical implementation of these orders varied drastically between different provinces. Local governors, many of whom had adoptionist sympathies or simply wished to avoid unnecessary conflicts, often turned a blind eye to minor violations of Nicene orthodoxy. Adoptionist resistance manifested in creative and unexpected ways. Some theologians developed coded language that appeared superficially orthodox but allowed for adoptionist interpretations for initiates. Others took refuge in remote monasteries where they could preserve their traditions away from episcopal surveillance. The heresy was being forced into clandestinity, but it was not being eliminated. In the years following Nicaea, a sophisticated network of adoptionist resistance emerged from the shadows of official Christianity. Led by exiled bishops and dissident intellectuals, this network developed ingenious methods for preserving and transmitting their doctrines without attracting persecution. Remote monasteries became centers for preserving adoptionist manuscripts, disguised as works of orthodox devotion to avoid detection. Marcellus of Ancyra became a central figure in this resistance. Formally orthodox, he developed a theology that so strongly emphasized Christ's humanity that it functionally revived adoptionism. Marcellus argued that Jesus' divinity was transient, manifested during his earthly life but returning to the Father after the Ascension. His formulation, Eva's Arianism, spread like wildfire throughout Christendom. A fierce resistance began to form. Orthodox bishops, especially in the West, realized that something fundamental was at stake. It wasn't just an abstract theological matter. It was the very essence of Christianity that was in danger of disappearing forever. Athanasius of Alexandria emerged as the main opponent of Arius. This young Egyptian bishop possessed a brilliant mind and an unwavering determination. He immediately understood that accepting Jesus as a created being would completely destroy the doctrine of salvation. If Christ was not truly God, how could he save humanity? Athanasius's logic was devastating to the Arians. He argued that only God could reconcile humanity to himself. A created being, however exalted, could never pay the infinite price demanded by humanity's sins. It was a matter of spiritual mathematics. Only the infinite could cover an infinite debt. The debates became increasingly intense and public. Crowds gathered in squares to hear the arguments from both sides. Merchants, artisans, and even slaves fiercely debated the divine nature of Christ. The Roman Empire had never witnessed such theological passion among ordinary people. The tension reached dangerous levels as fights began to erupt in churches. Families were divided, communities fragmented, and the unity that Constantine so desired seemed more distant than ever. The emperor realized he had to make a drastic decision before the entire empire plunged into religious chaos. In 325 AD, Constantine convened the first ecumenical council in Christian history. 318 bishops from across the empire were summoned to the city of Nicaea in present-day Turkey. It was an unprecedented assembly. Never had so many Christian leaders gathered in one place to decide matters of faith. The atmosphere was charged with tension as the bishops arrived at the imperial palace. On one side, Arius and his followers, confident that their rational logic would prevail. On the other, Athanasius and the defenders of orthodoxy determined to preserve what they considered the fundamental truth of Christianity. The emperor himself presided over the sessions, aware that the empire's future depended on this decision. The debates were intense and at times heated. Arius presented his arguments with eloquence, citing biblical passages that seemed to support his position. When Jesus said, "The Father is greater than I," wouldn't that prove his inferiority? When he was called the firstborn of all creation, wouldn't that indicate he was created? Athanasius and his allies counterattacked with equal vigor. They argued that these passages referred to Christ's humanity, not his divinity. They cited other texts where Jesus claimed equality with the Father. "I and the Father are one. Whoever has seen me has seen the Father." The interpretation of Scripture became an intellectual battlefield. As the days passed, it became clear that a definitive decision had to be made. There was no more room for half measures or compromises. Christianity would either follow the Arian path, transforming Jesus into a sublime created being, or maintain the belief in his full and eternal divinity. The bishops gathered at Nicaea faced a monumental challenge: how to express in human words truths considered divine. They needed to create a declaration of faith that was precise enough to exclude Arianism, but broad enough to unite all Orthodox Christians under a single banner. The key term that emerged from the debates was homoousios, a Greek word meaning of the same substance. This word would become the ultimate dividing line. The Orthodox insisted that Jesus was homoousios with the Father, of the same divine essence. The Arians violently rejected this term, preferring homoousios, of similar but not identical substance. It was incredible how a single letter could determine the fate of an entire religion. The difference between homoousios and homoiousios was just a Greek I, but it represented an insurmountable theological chasm. This small letter would define whether Jesus was truly God or merely an exalted creature. The Nicene Creed was formulated with surgical precision. "We believe in one Lord Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of God, begotten, not created, of the same substance as the Father." Every word was carefully chosen to close all possible Arian escape routes. The phrase, "begotten, not created," was particularly devastating to Arius's position. When the vote arrived, only 2 bishops refused to sign the creed. Arius was condemned as a heretic, his books were ordered to be burned, and he himself was exiled. It seemed the heresy had been definitively defeated. But this victory would only be the beginning of an even longer and more bitter struggle. The defeat at Nicaea should have been the end of Arianism, but Arius and his followers did not surrender easily. In the years following the council, they organized a sophisticated campaign to undermine the decisions made. Using political influence, economic pressure, and even imperial manipulation, the Arians achieved an impressive turnaround. Constantine, initially satisfied with the apparent unity achieved at Nicaea, began to question his decision. Arian advisors whispered in his ear that Athanasius and the Orthodox were inflexible extremists. Gradually, the emperor was convinced that perhaps the Arian position was more moderate and reasonable for maintaining peace in the empire. In 335 AD, just 10 years after Nicaea, Athanasius was exiled from Alexandria. The great defender of orthodoxy was accused of causing disturbances and promoting divisions. For many Christians, it seemed the world had turned upside down. How could the condemned heretic now be gaining ground while the champion of the Orthodox faith was banished? Arius was called back from exile and received with honors in Constantinople. It seemed his revenge was complete. He had survived condemnation, overcome his opponents, and was now on the verge of seeing his theology triumph throughout the empire. But fate held a dramatic and mysterious twist for this story. On the eve of his official reintegration into the church in 336 AD, something extraordinary happened. Arius, apparently healthy and confident, died suddenly under bizarre circumstances. Some said it was divine judgment, others suspected poisoning. His sudden death shocked both Arians and Orthodox, leaving the movement temporarily without its charismatic leader. Arius's mysterious death did not end Arianism, which continued to spread for decades. Successive emperors alternately supported and persecuted the Arians. Athanasius was exiled 5 times during his life, becoming a living symbol of Orthodox resistance. Only at the end of the 4th century, under Theodosius I, was Arianism definitively banned from the Roman Empire. But did this heresy truly disappear? Modern scholars argue that echoes of Arian thought can be found in various Christian movements throughout history. Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, teach that Jesus is a created being, a position remarkably similar to Arius's 17 centuries ago. The battle between Arius and his opponents established precedents that shape Christianity to this day. The Council of Nicaea created the model for all future councils, where complex doctrinal issues are debated and decided by an assembly of ecclesiastical leaders. The very concept of heresy was refined through this controversy. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this story is how a seemingly abstract question about divine nature mobilized such intense passions. Ordinary people fought in the streets defending theological positions that many today would consider incomprehensible. This reveals something profound about the human thirst for truth and transcendent meaning. The question Arius raised, "Who is Jesus Christ truly?" continues to echo through the centuries. Every generation of Christians needs to rediscover and reaffirm its answer to this fundamental question. The heresy that nearly destroyed early Christianity reminds us that the most precious truths often need to be defended against unexpected challenges, coming even from within the faith community itself.